very thankful to be here today and share with all of you all the work that Vermont has been doing over the last 10 years to assist communities in the protection and restoration of our river corridors and floodplains. I start with this image because in Vermont, you are just as likely, if not more so, to be eroded away than to be inundated by floodwater. And I'm going to show how we've come to that conclusion using our damage surveys and our field stream geomorphic assessments, and how we then have used that data to develop river corridors that help explain erosion hazards and what communities can do to avoid them. We've worked really hard in Vermont to bring people into the data collection process, and I'm going to talk about some of the technical assistance programs that we have developed to help them use their data in their planning, mitigation, and avoidance efforts. I'm going to talk about some of the a few examples of the broad-based funding incentives that we put in place for communities to act. And finally, I'm going to explain how we have retooled our state emergency relief and assistance fund to increase the state cost share in flood recovery incrementally with the actions that communities have taken to increase their flood resiliency and protect river corridors. In Vermont, when I first started my career, there was a craze for a couple of decades in the 80s and 90s to go out and do stream restoration. We had folks coming in, local folks coming in with proposals that were intended to address erosion for the purpose of water quality, for the purpose of improving habitat, and mostly because unless they addressed the erosion, the landowners wouldn't allow them on their land. And so many of these projects, including the projects of yours truly, failed pretty miserably because none of us really had an understanding of what was the cause and the source of the erosion that we were trying to address. So a number of us went back, we got schooled as best we could in fluviogeomorphology to understand stream processes, and we then put it out to our local communities that were interested in working in streams and addressing erosion, that they needed to come to us with data, with information about why the streams were unraveling and how their project was going to contribute to a more systemic stability in that watershed. Before we would consider using the limited funding we had to help them with their projects. We developed a stream geomorphic assessment protocol that we put out there, and we provided funding for local communities to come in and get the resources they needed to hire professional consultants that we had trained in the use of our protocol to go out and collect data. So after several years, we started to see slightly better projects. The data was pouring in to our state data management system through a rigorous QA process that we had developed. And so not only were we starting to get a different conversation going on out in communities about why our rivers were eroding, but we were amassing quite a bit of data at the state level. Local communities had collected over 8,000 miles of remote sensing river data, over 2,000 miles of detailed field assessment data is now in our state database. And we're using that not only to teach and train and outreach at the local level, but to develop policy and program at the state level. All of this data together is telling a very big story. That the course of many of our Vermont rivers is a relic of over 200 years of channeling, draining, and dredging. More than 50% of our streams have been historically straightened. There's a growing consensus that our efforts to try to contain flows and rapidly drain the land has been a recipe for erosion. Most of the efforts that we did to protect ourselves from inundation were then translating into increased erosion in our river systems. Almost all of our channels in Vermont are undergoing major erosional and depositional processes in this channel evolution through different stages of channel evolution. nearly 75% of our stream channels are moderately to deeply incised, and redeveloping, widening and redeveloping floodplains through each successive flood. This was the type of erosion that we've been trying to deal with in our restoration. Ironically, most of the cross sections that were taken in the 70s and 80s to develop our NFIP maps were taken at a time when our channels were deeply incised. We have many rivers in Vermont where the 100-year flood doesn't even make it out of the channel. We were starting to get better projects from people, but we still needed to put out greater technical assistance on how to use all that data to come up with meaningful restorative work, meaningful hazard mitigation work. So we developed a river corridor planning process and pretty much required communities interested, our watershed groups, our conservation districts that were going to be bringing their work to us to have that project be the outcome of a river corridor planning process where we looked at watershed strategies for dealing with altered hydrology, for dealing with changes in the larger sediment regimens of our streams, and as well as deal with reach-specific projects that deal with the various stages of those channel evolution that were causing instability. This was, all of these projects were intended to help us manage our streams towards an equilibrium condition with a functioning floodplain. Then we had Tropical Storm Irene in the state, and we had, for a small state like Vermont, we had almost $800 million worth of damage, many communities cut off, thousands of miles of roads were undone. And our legislature went to work with our help and our data and our information to really try to address some of the shortcomings that they were seeing in our state programs. And one of the things that they required us to do when they saw all the damage, there was a conversation in our state that while the municipality is largely responsible for land use decisions, there were many types of development that were exempt from municipal regulation. And all of those activities, whether it was state projects, state transportation, utilities, agricultural practices, all of these activities were not being regulated with respect to floodplains in Vermont. So they filled that gap by giving the state the authority to do that regulation. And we had to then ramp up our data collection and our river corridor development. We put together a GIS program that allowed us to develop meander belt-based river corridors for all of our rivers. And we put that online in a GIS application with the FEMA special flood hazard areas so that all communities can go and look at these two layers together to understand not only the inundation hazards that exist in their communities, but what might be the erosion hazards as well. We're now in the process of bringing in the 2,000 miles of detailed studies into these preliminary maps that we've put together that are now available for communities online. The other thing that that has happened in Vermont is the directors of our programs many years ago decided that the National Flood Insurance Program, the state floodplain manager, should be located within the same program of the engineers that manage in-stream alterations. And we've been trying to combine these programs now for the last decade, and it's really hard for me to imagine now that you could do it otherwise, that you could not be looking at floodplain function, floodplain restoration, and separate from our ability to work with communities on stream alterations. After Irene, they instructed the agency to develop not only state rules for our floodplains and river corridors, but to put together rules for our stream alterations. So we took advantage of that opportunity to meld together our performance standards for both in-channel work and floodplain and river corridor development. Basically, understanding that, yes, we are going to protect those existing structures that are out there, those habitable structures that are out there, but going forward in our work with communities to deal with post-flood situations and to deal with stream instability, no project can change the dimensions, the pattern, or the profile of the stream in such a manner that it's going to cause it to unnaturally aggrade or degrade. That we're not going to look at putting new encroachments in river corridors that's going to one day result in the need to do that channelization to protect those structures. And that when we put in bridges and culverts, we're going to make sure there is no discontinuity, both longitudinally and laterally with the floodplain, that has been the source of much of the damage that we've seen. So river channel and floodplain management, in my experience, must go hand in hand. This is an example of the type of activity that we saw after Irene in many of our communities. This post-flood channel work, in my experience, has been the number one reason why we've seen the level of damage year after year. In Vermont, in Tropical Storm Irene, it was our experience that much of the damage was associated with the channelization work that went on in the 1973 and 1976 floods. So our rules now acknowledge that communities need to get in and do emergency actions in a post-flood situation, but they need to follow certain practices in order to gain the authorization that they need to do work like this. This project was shut down by our engineers. We pulled the machines out and we went directly into town and sat down with the town select board members and explained to them why the town up there putting back the backyard of these folks after Irene was endangering public infrastructure and all the residences downstream. And it was a very tremendous experience. That evening we were at a public meeting and a lot of the folks came into that public meeting very hot that the state had shut down this operation. And the chair of the select board got up and explained patiently to all his townsfolk why the state had done that and that the state had done them a favor in the long term. It gave us great hope that if you get out there, if you have the technical assistance people that can be on hand to work with communities when they're most in need and explain these processes, that they will begin to really work with us. To that end, we put together a 3-tiered training program. The road foremen are at the heart of these communities in Vermont. They're the ones that are working with the streams and rivers day in and day out. We put together a training program and put every state transportation worker through the first 2 tiers, and now we're working to get all the town road foremen to come in and understand the vocabulary of rivers, understand how rivers work, and how their actions can contribute to long-term stability in the river system. We put together these types of handy sheets that they can laminate and put on the cab of their truck that explain all the basic activities that they do and how that changes stream processes and stream morphology in a way that it might result in increased erosion or increased deposition in the stream, which then, of course, ultimately leads to erosion. So these are the types of resources that we're trying to get out there. Our goal is that at least when they see a problem and they get tempted to go out there and start digging in the stream or replacing a structure in their town road system, that they stop and think, how is this going to affect the stability of the stream? And if they aren't sure, to call us. We have 5 engineers in the state that are available. They do have a regulatory role, but most of the work that they do is technical assistance to communities that are trying to solve these problems. It's really important to have these resources out there. If I had you all day, I'd go down through all of these agencies at the state and federal level and at the local level and talk about how we've tried to work with every single one of these agencies to bring our data and the policies and the program, the different program priorities that we've developed over time into how they operate, into how they work with local communities. And that the legislature in Vermont recognized some of these efforts and required that we develop a flood resilient communities program where we work with our partner agencies to develop incentives in all of these various sectors. I'm going to talk about just a couple of them real quickly. More recently, we've been trying to combine our river corridor and our transportation corridor planning, working ANR, Agency of Natural Resources, and our transportation agency working together to understand the vulnerability of each road segment with respect to the adjacent river system, the erosion, the deposition, and the inundation processes that are going on, developing an app that you can click on any road, hopefully someday in the state of Vermont, and understand what kind of vulnerabilities exist. And VTrans is also creating incentive through their grant programs that the communities that are giving us projects that are working the stream towards an equilibrium condition are going to the top of the pile. We're also working with our housing, our community development agency, trying to put together information like this where we, again, combine our river corridor planning with our economic resiliency planning and our overall municipal planning. And they're trying to get information like this. The town of Middlebury saw a tremendous savings after Irene, where the 8,000 acres of functioning floodplain and wetland that lies between Rutland and Middlebury absorbed the floodwaters and cut the peak discharge of the flood in half. The UVM, University of Vermont, did some studies showing that this, over a 30-year period, the town of Middlebury is seeing nearly $600,000 a year in savings due to those functioning wetlands and floodplains. This is sort of the granddaddy of our incentives program for local communities. This is our emergency relief and assistance fund. If a town does nothing and there's a declared disaster, then the state will pick up 7.5% of the local cost share to the federal dollar. If a town adopts road and bridge standards, is enrolled in the National Flood Insurance Program, adopts local hazard mitigation plan and a local emergency operation plan, those four things brings the state cost share up to 12.5%. If the town adopts river corridor protections or is a part of the FEMA community rating system, allowing no new structures in the FEMA flood hazard area, the state cost share goes up to 17.5%. After a flood. For some of these small communities that get hit with big damages, this can be big dollars. So in summary, this is a sort of a build it and they will come story. We've worked, this is obviously a map of the state of Vermont and all of our municipalities. If you get the most important thing to do is get towns the information they need, the maps and the data to understand their hazards. These towns represent the towns that we're currently working with just in the last several years to do river corridor planning and then to feed into many of these incentive programs that I introduced briefly this morning. Here's the communities then that have picked up on our river corridor maps and the enhanced floodplain regulations, and with our assistance have adopted higher standards for their communities. And then finally, as our Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund incentive came into place, we've had a number of communities that have stepped forward, looking very hard at trying to increase that state cost share by adopting river corridor and floodplain protections. So a lot of this information is on our various web pages. This is a web page called Flood Ready Vermont. And we try to walk communities through this process of getting information, and the various planning exercises and incentives that are out there for them, as well as educational videos and training programs that they can take part in. They can go on to a little dialog box, type in their town, and see exactly what steps their community has taken to become more resilient and to address both their erosion and inundation hazards through river corridor and floodplain protection. So thank you.